Welcome to Realizing Resilience, a podcast from the Connecticut Women's Consortium. We're not behavioral health professionals, but we're your gateway to real conversations with the experts. Each episode, we'll delve into the vast landscape of mental health, from personal stories to expert insights. Together, we'll bridge the gap between clinical expertise and personal experiences, connecting with diverse voices and perspectives. Join us for insightful conversations that demystify the world of mental health.
Kelly Lynch is a licensed clinical social worker, retired EMT, personal trainer, and nutrition coach. She became an EMT in 2003 and worked in commercial EMS as an EMT and FTO for 10 years prior to becoming a therapist. Kelly has been a therapist for nearly 16 years and specializes in acute stress and post-traumatic stress injuries in EMS professionals. She opened Turning Point Wellness in 2014 with the goal of normalizing mental wellness in public safety to change the stigma of asking for help and increase the access and availability of appropriate support services to all professional and volunteer first responders. Kelly also owns the Grit Project, where she speaks nationally and internationally on topics related to mindset and problem solving. She specializes in teaching people how to practice authenticity and find personal and professional alignment through the power of self-leadership. Her first book, F the Rules, was published in February 2024 and quickly became an Amazon bestseller. Welcome back to Realizing Resilience. My name is Alana.
And I'm Marisa.
And today we have the pleasure of speaking with Kelly Lynch. Thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So you began your helping career as an EMT before becoming a therapist. Can you share a little bit about your journey changing careers and what led to you founding Turning Point Wellness?
Sure. So there was a little bit of an overlap between the two careers. I was in school already to work on becoming a social worker while I was still working on the road as an EMT. And social work, I joke with everybody that it's kind of like my Bob Ross moment of life. It's a happy accident. I was not the kind of kid who grew up thinking like, I'm going to be a therapist. I know exactly what I want to do with my life. I didn't have the first clue that therapy was the thing that I was going to end up falling into. And it's been such a gift. EMS really was the first time that I truly had it hit home that I really enjoyed working with people and I enjoyed being a helper that people could look to in a time of need, and I could be that solid person that they could rely on. And so social work became the next most logical step as an extension of that, because I knew I have a bad back, so I knew EMS wasn't going to be a forever kind of job for me. So I needed that other thing. And in the process of exploring social work, it just became the next most logical step.
Yeah, they say that the people do it as a full career. They say it's kind of like a young person's game.
It is. It really is.
So you got to be able to, you're lifting people, it's the long hours. I'm sure it takes a toll.
Right. It does. It does. I mean, with the lifting alone, if you think about the average adult in America, there's anywhere from 250 to 300 pounds between the human that you are lifting and moving and then all of your gear plus the stretcher. It's not an insignificant stress that's put on the body to be able to engage in the field of EMS.
And aside from those obvious challenges, we had just mentioned the long hours and supporting people in traumatic experiences as well, which takes a toll on you, not even just the physical aspect, but
Sure.
What makes the EMS work so tough on their mental health?
So I think it's the combination of all of those things, right? Like shift work, we know there's some really landmark studies that have come out of the Sleep Institute of Pennsylvania, where they've confirmed and they've proven that shift workers, the majority of the time, typically end up with circadian rhythm sleep disorders. So we know that a lack of sleep makes everything harder, right? Like we reduce brain function, we alter our neurochemicals, right? Like our bodies just really start to suffer and struggle with that. And then obviously vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, burnout rates are unbelievably high in public safety. One of the most recent studies that was done on rates of PTSD in EMS professionals is that EMS professionals are somewhere in the neighborhood of about 21 to 22% rate of occurrence of PTSD, whereas the general public is about 6%. So PTSD is extraordinarily high across the board in public safety, but if I focus specifically on EMS, because that's what I know, it's about 22%. And then you become the job, right? The job is so consuming in so many different ways for so many different reasons, more than I could lay out in one podcast interview. And so you become it. and you start to lose your sense of identity, right? Like you're exposed to such significant things that you start feeling like the only people who really understand you are the people that you work with, because they're the ones who get it without you needing to explain it. And oftentimes people will go home to their layperson spouse or layperson significant other or their kids, and the spouse doesn't want to hear anything about it. They might say that they want to hear about a shift or a call, but when you start telling your stories, they're like, "Oh, whoa, no, I don't want to hear about that. That's too much for me," right? So being inside of that job becomes so consuming because there's a relatability factor inside of the culture of public safety that's really important that we don't talk about enough. And so people start to have their home lives really struggle when they feel like there's no place else in the world that people can relate to them or understand them except at work. So when we start to see people get really consumed by the job, like these are the biggest stressors that public safety professionals don't know how to name, right? Where, they just want that community and they find the community at work, right? And home starts to fall apart.
Yeah, and even thinking too about the physical demands, it seems so obvious, but I don't think we think about that as being a thing that then impacts your mental health, because
Mhm.
any injury has mental health ramifications, but especially if you're
Sure.
constantly putting your body through stress, and like firefighters too, the amount of stuff you have to carry while you're
Right.
removing people from a burning building, it's a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah, like if I think about a paramedic's gear that they'll carry into one call, not including the stretcher, they're carrying about 80 pounds of gear. And then they have to manage the stretcher and their patient on top of that if it's just them and their partner on scene and they don't have any help. One of the biggest times that I'm really worried about a first responder or a public safety professional is when they're out on injury, because then that sense of identity gets really, really disrupted. And, they start to just like sit at home and spin in this, well, but who am I if I'm not this thing? Who am I if I can't do this job? Right. And when we think about all of those things, that's where we have to start to really talk about that identity piece that's so important for first responders.
This is also very topical that we're having this conversation now, because for our newsletter, one of our board members just did an interview with Jane Gordon from AMR. She does the Wired team. And so she talked a lot about how the culture of AMR and their EMS culture has influenced the culture of kind of care that they've developed, and that mental health support is very normalized there. But so in general, how does the culture of public safety and first responder work influence how people receive care?
Yeah, so first I want to say, like, I think AMR, so Jane is with the Hartford division of AMR, and they have done a beautiful job with their Wired team. And it's so exciting for people like me who are on the other side of this now to start to see these kinds of teams develop for EMS professionals in particular. We've had peer support teams for firefighters and police officers for a long time, but this is really still very upcoming for EMS professionals in particular, along with dispatchers. And when we look at the culture of public safety and how it's changing, there's really, really good things that are happening, like the development of these peer support teams, so that we start to normalize that it's okay to not be okay when you work in the public safety field. But for a really long time, there was this culture of silence. And when I first got into EMS in the early 2000s, I took my class in 2002, and I started on the road as an EMT in 2003. And I'll never forget running my first really serious call. And my partners looked at me and they were like, "You good? Okay, moving on." Right? You didn't talk about it. And if you weren't okay, you had to either swallow that and play pretend to let other people know that you could handle it. Or if you were visibly like dysregulated, upset by something, you got sent home and told, in some cases, don't come back, right? Because there was this perception of, if you can't handle this, you don't belong here. Right. And so now the really nice things that are happening in the field of public safety and in the first responder world are that we're letting it be okay that people don't have to always be okay. First responders are looked at as these are the people who are supposed to be the heroes. But what do we do when the first responder who's supposed to be the hero doesn't have the capacity, right? They might have the ability, but ability and capacity are two really different things. When they're so burnt out and they're so traumatized, their compassion fatigue is just tanking. What do we do to help the hero? Now that we're starting to talk about that, the field is really beginning to change in some really great ways where mental health and mental illness are normalized, and we can openly have these conversations where we couldn't in the past.
I think too, at least what I've seen of EMS and the culture through my fiance is it's very male dominated situation in an
Yes,
industry. So you have that like rub some dirt in it, suck it up and you'll be okay kind of a
100%. Yep.
feeling
Yeah.
towards a lot of things.
Yep. There's a level of bravado of I can handle the worst of the worst. And but at what cost is the question that we really need to be asking. And we should have been asking that question decades ago, right? And now that we are asking it, this is where we're seeing these really great programs and peer support teams and things like that emerging from.
Even now that more and more women are kind of joining these industries, I think that's also changing things too, because the women are saying like, was it that awful or did you experience this? And I think, I mean, at least from what I've seen, now some of the guys are like, wait, that actually was awful. Now that I think about it, that was kind of horrible.
Right.
We're
Right.
having, yeah.
I will say when I first got into EMS, the women were sometimes harder on me than the men were. And the men, I learned so much from my male counterparts in the early 2000s when I first started in this field about how to compartmentalize. Like we never had those direct conversations, but there was such modeling of, okay, this is it. None of it was healthy. I want to emphasize that, but there was a level of, okay, I'm going to take you under my wing. And I'm going to show you how to do this, and it's either going to work or it's not, but we're going to figure it out. And the women were very much like sink or swim, right? So I experienced women in the early 2000s as being much harder on me than my male counterparts. And I think in some ways, it's a real reflection of how hard they had to fight to just be accepted as one of the fold, right? And and I don't love that for them, right? Like that as a woman, that makes me feel really like icky in some very particular ways. But especially with a younger generation coming into public safety now, this is where I've seen the biggest tide turn, that people who are in their 20s and early 30s are much more open to these conversations of we need to talk about this because we're normal people doing and seeing things that are not normal to do and see. And so I think part of it is, women in today's day and age being much more emotionally intelligent and having the ability to have these conversations in a very open and very honest way. Now, that wasn't always the case. And then it's bolstered by this younger generation that is also much more open to having these conversations. It's all just really good.
I love too what you said about capacity versus ability and how they're not the same thing. I was a teacher for a while too, and it's the same thing where it's like you have to compartmentalize to a degree to be able to do the
Sure.
job. And even if you are affected by something, that doesn't mean that you're not capable of doing it. So I
Yeah.
think that's a really wonderful way to think about it, and I think is really illustrative of the culture shift.
I have that conversation a lot with my first responder clients where I say to them, look, ability is just the stuff that you have the knowledge to know how to do. You know how to start IVs. You know how to breathe for somebody. You know how to do CPR or what to do when somebody's bleeding. But that doesn't always mean that you have the capacity to do it. And capacity is the energy that it takes to perform a particular task. And if you're burned out, you're still capable. You still have the things, you still have the knowledge, but that doesn't mean that you have the energy to perform that task in a truly competent way if you're suffering as a human being. And so those are the conversations that we have in the therapy space now that really like bolsters the whole conversation across the board culturally to say it's all right to not be all right.
I think that's a good shift to be having, and I think this is a great time to be having it
Mhm.
as well, kind of societally and all that too.
Definitely.
And you'll be offering a training with us, Resilience Rising, working with EMS and firefighting professionals on February 21st. Can you kind of talk a bit about what your teaching style is like and what kind of activities or approaches you use in the training to engage people and keep it kind of practical?
Yeah, so I really like to just be able to have conversations with the audience that I'm teaching and to engage them in, okay, did you think that this was the case? Or did you know this about public safety? And when we talk about like the history of public safety professionals and where so many of these different arms of public safety began, a lot of people don't realize EMS in particular really didn't become what it is today until the mid 1970s. EMS was founded in our country in the form that it is today in 1972. So EMS is a very, very young industry. And because it's so young, there's a lot of disorganization in it still, where it's got a lot of room to still grow and change and evolve into a much more organized profession like firefighting is. And that's not a knock to EMS. It's just, we're just not there yet. So when we look at these kinds of things, this is the kind of stuff that I like to teach, working with clinicians who are interested in working with first responders to really talk more about the culture of public safety and what to expect in what it's like to work with first responders. A lot of people also don't realize that first responders want to vet us so that they can figure out whether or not we can handle the stories that they have to tell. And that's such an important part of working with first responders. So that's a lot of what we'll go over in February when we meet.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. The way that you speak about this is so concise and clear and relatable, and I think that's going to be wonderful for participants. So I'm very excited.
I am too. This is my second family in a lot of ways. So I'm really excited to get to teach clinicians how to be more effective in working with first responders. And I'm excited to get to do this.
Yeah, it's kind of like supporting your hometown,
Yes.
From somewhere else, going back to your roots a little bit. That's nice.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for talking with us today. This was great.
Thank you for having me.
Links will be in the description to learn more about Kelly and sign up for Resilience Rising, working with EMS and firefighting professionals on February 21st. Check out our links below to keep up with the Connecticut Women's Consortium. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Bye.